We will go ahead and kick it off. I'll just do a very quick introduction. I'm Lucas. I'll be presenting here today. I'm our head of global privacy strategy at InfoTrust, and I am honored to be joined by a gentleman and a scholar. Tyler, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, the short version of my intro, since it's only a 30-minute webinar, I'll do the half the time, is I have been an engineer in the MarTech space for 10 years. I've been in InfoTrust for 10 years, and I have moved on to the strategy team where I help customers work through problems in an evolving landscape. And we're going to talk a little bit about some evolving landscapes today.
Wonderful. All right. Now, as we kind of get started, today we're going to be talking through bringing clarity to chaos, but trying to just get everyone a very good conceptual understanding of what changes and what does not in today's shifting privacy landscape. As I get through just one quick bit of housekeeping, I just launched a poll to be able to try to get a little bit of feedback as we go into this for how confident you feel with your understanding of what the privacy environment will look like come 2025. And as folks fill that out, one quick disclaimer, we're not going to go into any regulations or provide any advice in that area today, but because we'll kind of allude to some, always have to just call out, this is educational content, not meant in any way to be any kind of legal guidance. For that, definitely consult with your legal counsel. All right. So with that, then, as we end the poll, it looks like most people are in that it's really murky for me area in terms of what's changing, what's not, what that means for businesses. So hopefully today, at the very least, we can get everyone up to a very good directional understanding so that we can start applying a lot of these concepts to strategies and to actions within business. Now, when we're talking about the shifting privacy landscape, what's really important to do, especially over the last 3 weeks, is really address the elephant in the room. And that is what is happening with third-party cookies as it relates to Google Chrome. Now, how I like to position this or kind of explain it is third-party cookies had their Wolf of Wall Street moment a few weeks ago, and they are not leaving in Chrome, at least for right now. Now, this does not mean third-party cookies are going to be around forever. It also does not mean that the environment remains the same. Where we stand right now is that Google Chrome has announced that they will not be forced deprecating support for third-party cookies, but they will be introducing a new experience for users to be able to select if they want an experience that has support for those or does not. And so when we think about where we'll land on the tail end of this, how I think about it is that we have a little bit of a range of possibilities. On the low end there, if the user experience for that choice is embedded in settings, things like that, we'll have some people that will actually turn that on. It's similar to how some people use like private browsers or incognito modes, but it'll be a small proportion just because of how that user experience would likely look. Now, if we take the current market state where Safari, Firefox, as well as a number of other more privacy-focused browsers have already deprecated support, we add in a small proportion of Chrome users. And on the lowest end possible, we're looking at 30, 35, 40% of users on the web that will not have support for third-party cookies within their browser. That's probably even lower than what the reality would look like even with that experience, especially for businesses operating or focused in the US as well as Western Europe. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if Chrome introduces an experience similar to Apple's ATT, where it is a prompt with tracking language giving a top-level choice of accept or decline between those two options, in that case, we can look at Apple's ATT, opt-in and opt-out rates, as kind of instructive here. In that case, for 2023, a lot of the figures point to kind of median figures across all industries of around 78% of users that select to not be tracked by third parties across applications. So if we apply that same type of proportion, in addition to Safari, iOS, as well as Firefox traffic, we're looking at upwards of 90 to 95% of users across the web that would not have support for third-party cookies. And so again, when kind of addressing this elephant in the room, where we stand is that in principle, third-party cookies may still be there. In practice, not really. And in practice, it's not a viable kind of method to build our solutions on top of. Anything that remains, great. Give some more signals in order to be able to feed into modeling and measurement, but it's just not something that is sustainable, really.
I got one thing to add on this slide. I'll jump in and add some color. This will be mostly the Lucas Long show for as far as narrative, but I'm gonna jump in and add some color. One thing that I often talk to people about on this is you're already living partially in this world. Like Safari and iOS are already don't have third-party cookies and you're partially in this world. What are your marketing tactics that are working in this space? What understanding do you have of this? Knowing that this threshold, this percentage is variable, as Lucas just described, will be variable in this, but having an idea on what outcomes you'd be after as you transition to more dominance in the world of not having third-party cookies, when that becomes more of reality, what are the tactics that are working and how can you set yourself up for success as that scale goes? One of the things that Lucas talks about a lot is an appetite for risk. Well, what is the risk of not knowing what to do when you step into this world that now becomes drastically more first party and you have no durable first party marketing tactics? So one of the things to do to prepare for this is just to think about what are the techniques I could be doing as this world trends in that direction.
Yep. And to get a solid foundation of that, we'll walk through here some of those concepts again for what is that current state, what goes away, what doesn't go away. So in order to kind of do this, now that we've established, what do we expect as it relates to third-party cookies and where they'll be, let's now talk through just the concepts. And I like to use a practical example of kind of how the internet works, how data collection works, and then what changes as a result of the current regulatory environment, as well as those technical changes like third-party cookie limitations, shall we say. So in order to kind of illustrate this, we'll use myself as an individual that is navigating through the web. So in the morning, I'm making coffee. I'm trying to determine how is it that I can optimize my cup of coffee. So I'm looking at different milk ratios for different types of beans or different approaches that I could be taking. Now, when I go to that website, in the background, a lot of things are happening. We have tags that are loading, which are third parties that are implemented on the website that are responsible for both the setting of cookies, the accessing of cookies, as well as the sending of information about my interactions up to third-party platforms. So we can kind of see some screenshots here of what that is. Now, for each of those platforms that are loading, they're doing a few different things. The first thing that they're doing is setting cookies and accessing the values in cookies. Now, at minimum, cookies that are set on an individual's browser are going to contain some type of a device identifier. And here you have device identifiers set in a first-party context and a third-party context. First party, only readable from that website. Third party, readable from other domains and other websites. And so when we talk about any kind of cookie deprecation, it's third-party cookies that are going away. And what this means will make a lot more sense here over the next 10 minutes. Now, in addition to that, tags are also responsible for the sending up or the collection of data across various different platforms, advertising, marketing, analytics, the whole nine. Now, at minimum, again, those tags are going to be collecting data, the values present in any of those cookies that they're able to access, third party, first party that have been set before, typically a device identifier. It's also going to, at minimum, send up the page that that individual is on, some context about the event or the interaction, as well as if an advertisement is shown, some type of ID related to that ad, to that campaign. Now, this happens in the background on every single page by all those different tags that are executing. And so as I go and navigate through just surfing the web, this continues to happen. So I start out doing some research, trying to optimize my cup of coffee. I'm going on holiday next week to the beach. So I'm looking at some new swim trunks in order to be able to get those. I'm then going to Google to do some comparisons between what I'd like to see on the Macy's website and what other offers and whatnot might be out there. I decide this is the thing for me. I go back, I add that product to my bag, I go through that purchase funnel. Then, because nothing is ever linear, I pick up some dog treats, and then I check the weather in Cincinnati. Now, all of this is happening, those tags and any ad tech platform that is deployed across those different websites are collecting, again, that minimum information of those cookie IDs, as well as those pages. And if we look here for those cookie IDs, we'll see that all of those are the same. So these would be third-party cookie IDs that are consistent for me, for my device, across all of those different web pages, all of those websites, all of those different interactions. And it's this that is used in order to be able to tie those activities and those actions together to drive things like attribution, to drive measurement, associating a view or an action in one place with conversion somewhere else, as well as to underpin principles for targeting. So understanding that, hey, I'm looking for this particular product, you can target me with that elsewhere. And kind of in addition to those third-party cookies for just the device identifiers, these ad tech platforms are also building out what are called identity graphs underneath the hood. And what this is pulling together different bits of identity that have been collected or provided to them for individual users over time. So we see in that left column third-party cookie IDs. We have mobile app IDs, which are advertiser IDs for mobile devices as you're interacting with an application. You have email, which could be submitted if someone signs up for something, or if it is provided by, say, a data broker or something like that. And then also IP address. Now, IP address for any kind of client-side data collection via those tags, always going to be collected. That's just how the internet works. Now, traditionally, organizations have focused on using third-party cookies in order to be able to tie interactions together. As those become a little bit less reliable and prevalent, IP address is starting to become a fallback for a lot of different platforms. So I always call that one out. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening with those here shortly. Now, that data collection that I mentioned before, a lot of it's happening. There's a lot of different platforms and tags that are loading across each individual website. And in addition to just the volume of tags that are loading, we also see, like you can see at the bottom of that visual, what we call piggybacking of tags, which would be one platform that is loading in or injecting other platforms and sharing information amongst each. Now, that behavior is most often the purpose for that behavior is most often cookie matching, or sharing of those IDs and sharing of that identity across different platforms in order to better build out that identity graph for each of those tools and make me or my device much more identifiable across a broader swath of the web. And a ton of this happens. But to kind of illustrate this, one scary, in my opinion, kind of finding, Consumer Reports did a study at the beginning of this year, and they used a panel of 709 volunteers. For those 709 volunteers, they found that on average, each one of those individuals had their behavioral information shared with Meta by on average 2,230 companies. Some of those panelists had their information shared with Meta by over 7,000 different companies. And so if we think about all of those different data points, if I'm going to 7,000 different locations on the web, but different companies are providing context about my behavior on their websites, with them in stores, on their customer lists, that's a ton of data to be able to understand or infer my interests, to understand, or infer where I am in different purchase funnels, what products I'm considering, who I am, what my interests are, the whole nine. And so that is what has traditionally underpinned everything for targeting, for measurement, for any kind of advertising type of a use case. Now, compare that situation where these ad tech companies have massive amounts of information for an individual with that of an advertiser. So in my purchase journey, I was going through and I was interacting with the Macy's website. For an advertiser, what type of visibility do you have visibility into? Is behavior on your owned and operated properties and a little bit of insight from different earned, paid, or owned media or ad tech or media platforms, I guess, that you are advertising on. So in this case, you have information about my behavior, in Macy's case, on the Macy's website, as well as a little bit of insight about how I'm interacting or searching for their brands in Google. So if we compare that state to the ad tech company's state, it's obvious why so much reliance has been on that which we can get from various different platforms. Ad tech companies just have more information about users because they're able to associate those behaviors and use those identifiers in order to be able to track that behavior across so many different touch points. Whereas advertisers have a limited view into that which is happening in their owned and operated properties. And this is what has really spurred and been the impetus for a lot of the privacy changes that are going on. And so for those changes, the first thing that was introduced were regulations. And so with regulations, GDPR grants individuals the right to have explicit choice for the collection and processing of any of their personal data. Now, what that means is that we lose visibility into interactions for those individuals across different touch points. And so some of this goes dark. There's no more information that's being able to be collected. In the US, laws grant the ability for opt-outs. And so for some individuals, we might not be able to use their data for different types of use cases. And so there's a little less visibility as a result of the regulatory environment. We then have things like third-party cookie deprecation. And so we lose that ability to be able to have a unique identifier with which to associate behaviors with a user over time and across different domains and locations. Now, think back to those underlying identity graphs as well. Third-party cookie deprecation or limitation of those signals lose that identifier. Things like Apple's ATT, as well as the coming Android Privacy Sandbox initiative, giving individuals the ability to opt out of the sharing of those device identifiers for applications. Some of those go dark. Things like Apple's Hide My Email, as well as individuals using fake emails or being a little bit more concerned about the sharing of their personal information, means we have fewer of those emails. Now, I mentioned before, a lot of platforms are starting to kind of back into using the IP address. The IP address is still there right now, but it is notable in Chrome's announcement for their change to third-party cookie deprecation. They also announced IP protections that are being added into, at first, incognito mode, possibly also making its way into the general browser experience. So even IP addresses are likely to be kind of in the future on the chopping block to be able to limit the ability for access to any of those kinds of identifiers as well. So we think back to kind of the ad tech platforms, ad tech companies. What type of visibility do they have right now? Well, they still have visibility into some interactions of users across different web pages and different websites. They have no means of being able to associate those behaviors together with the same device, with the same individual across domains and over time. And they also have fewer, with opt-outs, they have fewer abilities in order for use cases for which to use some of that user information and behavioral information. Now, if we contrast this state back with our advertisers, we've faced the exact same changes or shifts in the privacy environment with things like opt-outs, with things like explicit consent, as well as even for third-party cookie deprecation. But what we're left with is still a clear view into individuals' behaviors across our owned and operated websites. we still have some information that's available from the various different third parties in terms of performance or interactions with the brands. But then we also, but we now have a much better ability or much better visibility relative to various different third parties. So to kind of summarize here, when we think about that difference between first party, third party visibility, oftentimes everyone wants to start with, hey, first party data is super valuable. Well, it is, and it always has been. But what these changes really dictate and underscore is the fact that relative to third party data, or that which is available through third parties that we're working with, first party information is what is left over. And so this is what then drives a lot of those changes that Tyler had mentioned at the top. We have to change our approaches in order to be able to have approaches which are reliant on first party data and the signals that are kind of remain, as opposed to third party information and the different deterministic signals and identifiers that were relied upon before. So to kind of summarize here, what changes? Regulatory environment reduces our ability to collect and use data, personal information, behavioral data for some consumers that have exercised some of their privacy rights. Things like third-party cookie deprecation, general signal losses for identifiers reduces our ability to identify consumers across different domains, as well as over time. What doesn't change is that ability to identify and view consumer behavior within our owned properties, as well as the ability in many cases, especially in the US, to measure within owned and operated domains. So ultimately what we're talking about here with the shifting privacy environment, even as we add in more regulations, which, by the way, all confer the same privacy rights for individuals, as well as even as we lose different signals and potentially lose more access to third-party cookies and have less of those available, we still have the first-party side of things. And so our use case is impacted here as we have less data available for profile generation, interest-based targeting. We have significant decreases in audience sizes for retargeting. And we have reduced efficacy for deterministic styles of third-party attribution. And that is regardless of kind of what additional changes happen, because any change is impacting things in these exact same ways. So conceptually, if we can really internalize all of this for what does change, what doesn't change, regardless of how those changes continue to accelerate or progress, we have a very grounded understanding and foundation from which to be able to determine strategies as well as evaluate new solutions.
Got a little bit of flavor to add here too, Lucas. Just I've been thinking Lucas is so good at narratives. I wanted to not break up the flow there. It was a wonderful journey to go on. But some things to talk about are just common questions I hear from the technical side of things. One is people will be like, well, how long until they get rid of first-party cookies? Like, what are we allowed to identify? They'll think of things like this. One thing that's really important to know is as MarTech or analytics people or anybody really in the digital measurement world, we're sharing web functionality with people that build websites and people that work on things. So you have to look at like what technology and what functionality. It's not meant for tracking. It's just meant for the web working. When you think of the fundamental difference between a first-party cookie and a third-party cookie, a first-party cookie is something that will keep you logged into a website, let you know what settings you have there. It's the functionality that allows the web to work well. If you didn't have a first-party cookie, every time you went to a new show on Netflix, you'd have to log in again, and you'd have to log in again. So that type of technology is how the internet has worked. This first-party connection is how this has been built. The third-party cookies were designed for tracking purposes. They were designed so that you could share identity from site to site to site. It's really what we're talking about as an identity thing. So one thing people always wonder, what's the future of first-party cookies? Is that truly a durable option? Yes, it is. That's how the internet's built. That is not going away, so you don't have to worry about that. I get that question fairly often. Another one, and we'll tease a future webinar that'll cover some of these things here in a minute. But the another thing to think about is, how should brands be thinking about first party identity? Like, how do, now that it's clear after this first party identities are important, but like, how do you think around that? One is, how does your experience cultivate trust? Why would they want to share their identity with you? Are you a company that is encouraging that through good consent management and a good experience, and they trust that you will take care of this identity that they're handing over? Obviously, if 80% of people are backing out of tracking, they don't exactly trust what's happening with that data. So that's a thing to think about. And another soapbox that I will never, ever get off is A/B testing. A/B, what are your goals? If you're trying to drive more user signups, if you want people to give you their first party identity, why aren't you testing techniques to get to there? Once you've identified those goals and what they are, figure out how to get that incremental change. And the last thing is, when you're thinking about these problems, a thought experiment that is very good for a company, it's a bit terrifying, but very good, is, how would we run the business if we had no identity at all? How would we, if identity was just gone, how would we run the business? Now, that's not going to be the case. We're still going to have first party identifiers, in some case third party, but then you're going to become very aware of techniques that help you measure the business in a cookieless world, and you'll understand how that can impact your overall strategies.
Yeah. And speaking of strategies and kind of what are those different solutions? So ultimately, we can talk about, what will be the state of things and what is the state of things. But the challenge that we're now faced with is, how is it that we go about accomplishing core advertising, marketing, analytics use cases in this new environment? And to answer that question, we have a solution series for all of these topics that is forthcoming. So the first in the solution series will be on October 17th. Register today on our events page. There we'll be talking about some of those principles that Tyler mentioned for how to optimize first-party data collection. Future kind of sessions in that series, we'll be talking about effective targeting, attribution, getting the most from limited signals, consumer insights to drive strategy. So a lot of good stuff there for what are solutions that are now available that I can use with that which is still available in order to be able to drive all those different outcomes.